So, just as Europe has been weakened by the Great Famine and the decline in food supply and public health, and the state of the culture is not as strong as it had been maybe 50, 75 years earlier, this society is now confronted by the Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in history. We know now that this, what medieval people referred to as the Black Death, is what today we refer to as the Bubonic Plague. We know this for a couple of reasons. The first is the study of skeletons. As you see here, we're able to compare the DNA of previous plague victims with that's still trapped in their teeth, with the DNA of the disease that we can study today. And so we know that this is the same disease. This disease is still present today. There were outbreaks in China at the end of the 19th century, in India at the beginning of the 20th century that led to the deaths of over 20 million people. Today, this disease is still present, most notably in Africa. If you have access to modern antibiotics, you're probably going to be fine. We also find this disease in the Rockies in the western United States, typically passed by or within the rodent population there. And so if you're in eastern New Mexico, as you can see on this map, you're probably doing okay, but you might want to be a little careful about going into those other areas of New Mexico. And you can also see there's one case in Chicago from some time. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, this disease is mostly spread by fleas. I've provided an image of the flea here, just so you know. This is a highly magnified image of what bites you if you get the disease. The fleas travel mostly on rats, as you can see on the next picture. When the rat which hosted the flea that carried the disease is dead, then the disease or the flea and the flea population will move on to other hosts, and this is when humans tend to get infected. So where does the Black Death first come to Europe, or how does it first come to Europe? It first comes to Europe in the city of Kaffa in 1347. So Kaffa is here in the Black Sea. And so this was a period when Europe was more and more economically connected with the rest of the world. And the reason for that was the development of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. And so the Mongols are not only great empire builders, they're also great traders. And they had developed trade with Europe and the city of Kaffa in the Black Sea. This was kind of a portal for trade with the Mongol Empire. And it was being administered by citizens of the city of Genoa, which is right here in Italy. So this just gives you a sense of how Europeans were branching out further and further during this period. The Genoese and the Venetians, city of Venice here, are the two great trading cities in Italy. They've established colonies throughout the Mediterranean. The city of Kaffa is one of those colonies that enables them to trade with the Mongols and to have access to goods coming out of Asia. And in 1347, the Mongols demand more beneficial trading arrangements, and they demand that the Genoese accept their sovereignty. And the Genoese say, well, we're willing to be your trading partners, but we're not willing to go that far. Which is pretty bold, because most people were defeated by the Mongols, and if the Mongols defeated you, the way the Mongols took care of cities that they conquered, it wasn't very pretty. But the Genoese defy the Mongols lay siege to the city, and the siege fails. The reason that the siege fails is that the Mongol army becomes afflicted with the Black Death. And as more and more of the population of the army dies, the army gets weaker, they have to pull out of the siege. Now, the story is that as the Mongols are leaving, they catapult the bodies of those who had died of the plague over the walls of the city, and the Genoese are celebrating, and the bodies fly past them. And it's like, well, that's a little bit weird. And then a few days later, they realize that the city has been infected with this terrible disease. Now there's movement among historians to say this isn't actually how it happened, but what we do know is true is that the Mongols failed in the siege of Kaffa because their army was struck by the plague. The plague spread to the Genoese inside the city of Kaffa. So the Genoese try and leave the city, they try and flee in time, and they flee to the city of Constantinople, the great capital city of the Byzantine Empire, a really important trading hub in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then they move on from there to Sicily, which was an important trading hub in the Western Mediterranean. Of course, they bring the disease with them. By the time they've reached Sicily, they've infected so many people that the disease is basically uncontainable. And so this disease will run rampant throughout Europe for the next 7 years and do a lot of damage in a population that was not ready to handle a disease of this kind of virulence. So what are some of the effects of the Black Death? As I say, this is an area where we have to be very careful because it's very tempting to attribute everything right up until the Protestant Reformation to the Black Death. But there are some effects, some pretty direct consequences that we can point to. So first we're going to talk about the social impact. We estimate that up to 200 million of the population, that's between 40 and 60%, die as a result of this disease. That's obviously a huge number. We imagine that would change any sort of population. One indication of this economic change, economic, cultural, social change caused by such a great decline in the population is the Cathedral of Siena. This is one of my favorite cathedrals. It's an absolutely spectacular church. And the Sienese began to build this cathedral in the 13th century. They wanted to build a cathedral that would be bigger than the cathedral in the rival city of Florence. What's interesting is that this cathedral, as I said, is a spectacular church, but it was never fully finished. And you can see that there are some walls here that would have formed the rest of the church. The church would always be built in the shape of a cross. These are supposed to be just the arms of the cross. They become the whole length of the church because over 50% of the population of Siena dies in the Black Death. And even once the plague is over, there's no longer the population or even the willpower to continue on with this project. And so this cathedral today stands as a monument to the devastation brought by the Black Death. The other example that I would point to is this image over here. These are the ruins of a village that was abandoned as a result of the Black Death. And so what we imagine happened is that more and more people in the village got sick, and eventually those who were still alive fled to get away from the Black Death. And what's interesting is that the village was never re-inhabited. Even though the population of Europe is larger now than it was in the 14th century, when the population of Europe rebounds, it rebounds as an urban population as part of the Industrial Revolution. And so these villages, again, remain monuments to the devastation of the Black Death. They're abandoned by the few remaining survivors and never re-inhabited. Some people on a social level have pointed to the decimation of the clergy, that people at this time were typically pretty committed Christians. They wanted the sacraments and rites of the church for the dying. This meant that those of the clergy who were conscientious, who exposed themselves in this way, exposed themselves to the disease, they would die in greater numbers. And so those of the clergy that survive typically are less conscientious in their duties, or that's something that's not necessarily been proved, because it seems as though it's very difficult to isolate yourself from this disease. On the other hand, simply to lose this many clergy, it's very difficult to replace them. It takes a long time to train a priest and to form them to take up this role. And so while it's not clear that it was the good clergy, all the good clergy that died and all the bad clergy that survived, it is clear that you have a less experienced group of clergy to guide and lead the church and this part of society in the years after the Black Death. The Black Death also has a significant social effect in that you see the rise of this philosophy called Nominalism. We talked about scholasticism, that was the dominant philosophy in medieval universities. And this was a philosophy that was based on confidence, a confidence that human reason could understand the universe, could understand the way God had created the universe. And nominalism calls that into question, and seems to call that into question in part as a result of the Black Death. And so nominalists say that scholastics are constraining God, saying God has to act in a way that humans can understand. But we know that God is all powerful and God is not like a human being. And so you can't say that God acts in a way that humans understand. So that's the aspect of scholasticism that nominalism rejects. How does this play out over time? This plays out in a type of agnosticism that we see in nominalists. The nominalists argue that because we can't force God or claim that God is, or constrain God by saying that God acts in a way that human beings can understand, we should be far less confident about using reason and logic and the natural world to understand God. And so nominalists very much want to create a sharper division between what we can know through reason, the natural world, and what we can know through faith, which is the spiritual world. And so that's a change in the intellectual culture of Europe that's linked to the Black Death. And you can understand why. You've seen all this death and destruction. How could an all-good, all-powerful God allow this to happen? Well, maybe we don't know God as well as we did. So you definitely don't want to go away from this and say that nominalists think that God doesn't exist. They absolutely do, but they're much less confident that the world can tell us about God. And that's going to have very important consequences for the way that Europeans live and believe and worship in the future. So make sure you keep that in mind. Another social change is that we see a greater interest in the human person, and this is tied to nominalism. Just in the same way that people now say, well, we can't be as sure about God as we were in the past. We should probably stick to what we can know about the world around us. What's the most interesting thing in the world aside from God? Well, it's human beings. And so there's a greater interest in understanding human beings. And this is also linked to the Black Death in another way, that people want to tell their stories of living through difficult times. And so people want to know, how was it that if you survived the Black Death, how did you do it? What was that like? People want to look to the past. They want to say, how did people in the past encounter difficulties like the type of difficulties that we just encountered? And how did they overcome those difficulties? And so we have a greater interest in the human person as a result of the Black Death. And so this means that interest in human beings and human individuals increases as a result of this disease. Okay, we're going to talk about the economic effects of the Black Death, but I'm going to do that in the next lecture video.